And welcome back to Pepperdine University and the School of Public Policy. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of the School of Public Policy, and I'm just so excited to welcome you back here to the second edition of our Office Hours with Victor Davis Hanson. As you know by now, with each one of these sessions, we reflect back on the class Dr. Hanson just taught here at the School of Public Policy as our Giles-O'Malley Distinguished Visiting Professor. This semester, Victor is teaching a class titled Leadership and Key Decisions of World War II, and our grad students are learning about both the leadership skills, the challenges and opportunities practiced by both political leaders and military leaders in that conflict. So with that, we welcome in our Giles-O'Malley Visiting Professor, Dr. Hanson.
Thank you.
Victor, we're going to be drawing from two of the books that you had students read. The first is your book, The Second World Wars, and the second is Ian Kershaw's book, Fateful Choices. And as a way of organizing this time together, I actually just wanted to use the chapter titles from the Second World Wars. We'll begin with Supreme Command, those in the political leadership positions, then go into the warlords, look at the military leaders, then look at the workers. I think that's an interesting lens into the support of materiel for World War II, and then conclude with a chapter you titled The Dead. Let's begin with Supreme Command, and I think one of the very insightful points that you make is the importance of regime type. We touched on this in our last conversation, that between the Allied and Axis sides, not only were they opponents on the battlefield, they were very different ideologically and structurally, these two types of regimes that were fighting. And so I just wanted to quote a couple quick passages here and get your thoughts on them. This, again, from the Second World Wars. From 1939 to 1940, non-democratic dictators like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Joseph Stalin, as well as Hideki Tojo, from October 1941 to July 1944, posed as adept strategists without much need for subordinates to second-guess their genius. In contrast, the soon-to-be extinct Western European democracies, you say this as tongue-in-cheek, the appeasing Great Britain and the isolationist United States had all been confused and stymied by the rise of these single-minded dictators, Hitler in particular. The dozens of bickering strategists who surrounded Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt seemed essential. In matters of total war and mass mobilizations, the need to court voters seemed to have given the surviving democratic powers innate advantages over unstable and increasingly isolated Axis leaders. So, Victor, the importance of what was perceived at the beginning, that authoritarians would be able to make decisions quickly, they would muster their troops together, they would pull people around them. They were fighting these democratic leaders, certainly in Great Britain and in the United States, where there were bureaucracies, there was public opinion to court. It seemed that certainly in the early stages, the Allies were on the back foot, in part because of their democratic structures. But you say that in fairly short order, those democratic leaders were really strengthened by having to court public opinion.
That was a classical trope. It goes back to Herodotus, that he remarks at one time, when it's a question of going to war in Ionia, that it's easier to finally get riled up 30,000 to support a measure than it is oligarchs. And his point is that democracies, and Thucydides says that again and again, they're slow to anger, they're messy, but once they get on the same page, it's almost they have a groupthink or hysteria, and they can mobilize labor and capital, very important. So how that applies to World War II, that from 33, during the buildup of arms in Italy and Japan and Germany, all the way, say, to somewhere in early 42, the Axis had not been presented with a formidable enemy. So all of the decisions that in retrospect look flawed, the idea that you could bomb Britain into submission, or the idea that you could invade the Soviet Union easily, they worked fine for 2 or 3 weeks in Russia, or they seemed to be, but then once the Allies were mobilized, it turned out, and the Axis faced real difficulties, or real opposition rather than difficulties yet. The lack of give and take, the lack of discussion, the lack of opinions. When Hitler at one point said, well, why didn't you tell me that they had T-34 tanks? If I had known they had T-34 tanks, I would have never gone into Russia. Well, Guderian had told him that for 2 years. And what he was, even Hitler was saying he had not listened to people then he wished that he had. The other point is that in that Axis, and we've talked about that a little bit, in that Axis coalition, you had Nazism, Italian fascism, and authoritarian militarism in Japan. All of these were secretive, non-transparent types of governance. So when Hitler goes into the Soviet Union, Mussolini has no idea. Japan has no idea. When Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, Hitler says, where is Pearl Harbor? He's ready to go into the Soviet Union, and Mussolini decides to invade Greece, which is a quagmire. And Hitler said, why is he doing this? Well, their currency was distrust. So when you put all three of them together, they were mutually suspicious. On the Allied side, there were different governments. There was communism, which was authoritarian like the Nazis, but there was also 2 of the 3 partners were transparent. There was a parliamentary democracy, and there was an American constitutional republic. And that meant that they had a greater deal of trust, and even though Stalin could not be trusted, these 2 transparent and trustworthy allies made an effect on him, and that really made a difference. So the D-Day was not an Axis-type operation. It was closely coordinated with the United States and Great Britain, but also Stalin was apprised of it, so he had an offensive on the Eastern Front. It got down to the tactical level. If an American tank was reliable, durable, cheap to operate, easy to fix, but it was underpowered in terms of its gun, the British came in with a 17-pounder and made the Firefly. If the American airframe was more advanced than the Spitfire, but the Allison engine was less effective than the Merlin Rolls-Royce, then the 2 corroborated. And the British put in a superior engine into a superior American airplane. And the result was the best fighter of World War II that was propeller-driven, the P-51. So there was levels of coordination. And when they wanted to have Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, even before we declared war, they went over there, their representatives, Harry Hopkins, for example, and they said to Stalin, you are very good with industrial production, big tanks, artillery, rockets, but what can you not do? And he said, we don't make radios, we don't have ponchos, we don't have K rations, we don't have aluminum, we don't have aviation fuel. And they said, we can get you that, and if we can get you that, then that will free up more of your industrial capacity to do what you do well. And the result of that is they made more tanks and artillery than even more than America did. But they were very one-sided, and then we ended up, we being the Anglo-Americans, supplied somewhere around 25% of their material. So there was a level of cooperation based on the type of regimes or governments that the Axis didn't have. And the second point, an earlier point, is that Axis efficiency is fine when you're not up against formidable enemies. But by 1942, the Allies were in full production, and the window of opportunity was closing, and they did not have the cooperation or transparency necessary to adapt. And so from 42 on, it started to go downhill.
I wanted to touch on, and I'm going to jump over here to Kershaw's Fateful Choices, just to drill down a bit on the challenges. I think sometimes we forget how much of a challenge those democratic leaders, particularly Roosevelt and Churchill, faced internally in engaging in the war. Obviously, we talked last time just about the appeasement strategy, so-called, that Great Britain was practicing. But Roosevelt was also leading a country that was quite isolationist, and in many ways, over the course of several years, had to bring America to a place and the American people to a place that they would support it. But it was a very unpopular decision. And so I wanted to jump over to this out of Kershaw, in which he talks about, and there were several stages leading up to, obviously Pearl Harbor was a trigger point, but there were steps along the way in 1940 in particular, with some decisions made around amending the Selective Service Act that had to even make it possible, if America were to enter the war, that they would be ready. And even those steps met with a lot of resistance, both in Congress, but also in the American public. So I wanted to just read this paragraph from Kershaw and get your thoughts. The president's, and this is Roosevelt, of course, the president's sensitivity towards public opinion was shown to be justified in the heated debates that flared up in July and August over the issue of amending the Selective Service Act in 1940. At stake was nothing less than what General Marshall described as, quote, the disintegration of the Army. Had the administration failed to carry through Congress the amendments it was proposing, the large army envisioned under the Victory program, still being prepared, for future engagement in Europe would have been impossible. The strength of public feeling in the country, the United States, of course, alongside the intense battle in Congress, was a sharp reminder to Roosevelt that whatever the level of readiness to support Britain and now the Soviet Union too, the opposition to any notion of American soldiers being sent to fight abroad was as vehement as ever.
Yeah. Roosevelt was in a big dilemma because most of the country was isolationist. And today we make fun of isolationists. But isolationism had some very persuasive arguments to the American people. Number one, they did not want to get involved in World War I. They came late, April of 1917. In a year and a half, the Americans stopped the German invasion of spring 1918. They sent 2 million Americans over without losing any. And they finally were outproducing in terms of things like artillery shells. These are allies, France and Britain, that had been doing it for 4 years. And yet the Versailles Treaty was a disaster because within 20 years, it was signed in 1919, 20 years later there was a war. And the Americans' idea is we lost 117,000 people. We got over 250,000 wounded. We spent all this money. And what did we get out of it? They're back doing the same thing. Germany's causing all this trouble. They all want us to get back in. We're going to get back in there. We're going to fight. And then for 20 years, they'll do it again. We're done with them. The second thing is we were in the Depression. And we didn't really understand a measured and targeted type of Keynesian stimuli. In other words, Roosevelt's New Deal was sort of a government takeover of private enterprise, national recovery, all of that. And it suppressed productivity and GDP, and it did not allow entrepreneurship. Germany was a little different, actually. It seems bizarre, almost blasphemous to say this, but both Italy and Germany created autobahns in Germany, dams, new buildings, Italy, the railroad service, but they did it with sort of a corporate cronyism. And they were giving money and contracts, and they didn't interfere to the same degree that Roosevelt. And so they survived actually the Depression better than we did. So there were people who were saying, now we're broke. The third thing was, by 1918, we, in terms of actual money lent to the democracies, probably were over $1 trillion in modern currency. They didn't have the money, so they wanted to get it out of Germany. Germany didn't have the money, so they started inflating their currency and paying off their war debts in worthless marks. Then the Allies were not able to pay us back, and it was a chain effect. As Coolidge said, they want me to relieve the debt. They rented the money, didn't they? We didn't, so they owe us. So we weren't good about that. We didn't write that off immediately.
Right.
So all of that said, we do not. The isolationists really had a good, Robert Taft and Vanderbilt. They had a good argument. Roosevelt had a better argument, and that is Britain's on the edge of disappearing, and with it the British Empire. And after June, the Soviet Union, as evil as it is going to disappear. And they're going to have a world of Germany, Nazism, and eventually they're going to create, whether it would jets or ballistic, and they're going to be able to hurt us, or they're going to be able to control the allies of the New World against us. So whether we like it or not, we're going to have to face them. But I can't do it because there's no public opinion. So what his task was to see if he could get a draft, start spending stimulatory money on, and he said, the New Deal, it's no longer the New Deal, it's war. And what he meant was, I'm not going to say that we build up the military just for deterrence, but we also will have the stimulus. And his economic advisors basically said, you should have done this earlier. And he had a war production board, Robert Knudsen, Henry Kaiser, Henry Ford, really brilliant people that got extraordinary latitude. For a guy who was a neo-socialist, he basically said to these three capitalists and their associates, if you want to destroy 6 miles in Oakland and make an assembly line for Liberty ships, go ahead. If you want 1 million square feet of space in Willow Run in Michigan to build beach, go ahead. He gave them New Mexico thousands of acres for the Manhattan Project. But that was the one and only time in American history where the government gave unlicensed freedom, and it worked. We had enormous production. So Roosevelt was trying to move us to war, and then he would start to escort ships, merchant ships, to Britain. He always said, how can we, it's kind of blasphemous, it's crazy to spend all this money to help Britain and Russia and then see them go sunk by U-boats. So we're going to escort them at least up to Greenland. And that was the neutral zone. And if you went beyond that, they would sink you. But he kind of pushed it all the time because what he wanted was a German attack on an American ship, because he had guessed that the patriotic, latent though it was, of Americans would outweigh the isolation, their affront to their honor. The other thing he had a big problem was, and this was a great discussion, they said, we're not completely rearmed yet. If we start giving all of our aviation fuel, all of our food, all of our munitions, all of our planes, even though they're probably obsolete now by German standards, to Britain and to Russia, it's going to be just like what Britain did to France. It all ended up in the hands of the Germans because they're going to lose. So we can't really be openly supportive of the Soviet Union or Britain until they do their part. So he was watching, and sometime around late November, December, the intelligence showed that the Germans had taken 1 million casualties the first year. They'd killed 5 million people, but they were starting to slow. And by early December, there was a vast change of spirit. And then the Italian army had crumbled in North Africa, and Britain did not fall, and it was starting to fight back on the U-boat war. And people came to Roosevelt, Marshall, some of the people in the Joint Chiefs, Hap Arnold, et cetera, and they said, you know what, it doesn't look like Russia's going to fall. We were wrong, because they had said they would fall very quickly, and it doesn't look like the British Empire is going to dissolve. So if we start to help them, we can push them over to the winning ledger, and even if it's going to be more difficult than we think, our material and money will not fall in the hands of the Axis. And so that was a big change, and that really gave Roosevelt confidence.
I wanted to touch exactly on this point. I think, again, just returning to Kershaw's book, and I love the way that both of you write, because you do accentuate the importance of irony throughout these conflicts. And the reality of America's late entry, if you will, into the war actually had an upside, which you've just touched on, but I wanted to get your reflection here on how Kershaw puts it. There were, and this is this is Kershaw writing, there were, however, good reasons to defer the moment of entry as long as possible. The longer America could remain out of the formal combat, the more advanced her military buildup and the mobilization of an arms economy would be. Moreover, a declaration of war would doubtless have resulted in domestic clamor to utilize the arms and equipment now being sent to Great Britain and the Soviet Union for the United States Armed Forces, leading to a weakening, not strengthening, of the resistance to Hitler on the European fighting front in the short term, perhaps with disastrous consequences. Yes. So this element of timing really was ironic that America's late entry actually sustained our allies.
It had, even on the most basic level, because after they had seen Blitzkrieg in 1939 in Poland, 1940 in Western Europe, and after they'd seen what the Japanese were doing in China and the Pacific, they came back and said, a 37 millimeter gun on a tank is ridiculous. A 50 millimeter even is ridiculous. You have to have a 75 and even bigger perhaps. Our artillery is underpowered, and we thought we had the latest level of fighter pilot. The Wildcat is out of date. Our Dauntless, wonderful, best dive bomber in the world is out of date. Now we have to replace it immediately, so a lot of the stuff that we gave Britain and the Soviet Union, the P-39 Air Cobra and all, it was already out of date. So what we kind of did was we took our emerging inventory that we thought would be great, but we soon discovered after watching this war for 2 years was already obsolete. And we pushed it on the British. We gave them 50 old destroyers. We did all sorts of stuff. But in the meantime, these brilliant Caltech, MIT type of engineers, nautical engineers, they had on the drawing boards the Hellcat, the Corsair, the P-47, the P-38, the B-24, and especially a fleet that had already been designed and was being built that was larger than the Atlantic and Pacific existing fleets together. And more importantly, the new fleet had North Carolina battleships, the Iowa-class battleships, Essex carrier. They were the best in the world. So, and they all came online around late 1942, early 43. So Kershaw is saying, had we gone in 40, we would have been fighting with obsolete equipment, and we might have lost so many battles. We might not have had the wherewithal to just start with a clean slate as we did pretty much after 6 months. So it was fortuitous, and we learned a lot of the mistakes. And one of the things we realized very quickly, if the Soviet Union is going to survive Blitzkrieg, they need trucks, because the Germans, to the extent they're failing in the Soviet Union, it's because 80% of their divisions are horse-powered, with horses.
With real horses.
And they don't have enough trucks, and they're scrounging all of Europe. And we are the biggest truck builder. So we sent them 400,000 student American Motors, GM, Ford trucks, 400,000. We're so successful that, and this was right as we were getting into the, Goering's called them these awful automaton divisions, and they're robotic. He didn't use the word robotic, but automaton. We can't defeat these people because the Russians, these primitive people, are traveling 50 and 70 and 80 miles a day, moving 16,000 men in a division, all with American trucks. And so we really emphasized the right decision-making based on what we had observed as bystanders for 2 years.
That's a great segue into this next section. Now I'm coming back to your book, Second World Wars. And I wanted to get into the chapter that you title The Workers, which again is I think, usually forgotten part of the war is the materiel part and the advantages of different regime types, and not just in making military decisions, but also supplying militaries. And you make a very interesting point here, again, comparing the Axis and Allied powers as it regards to supplying military forces. This is what you wrote here. By war's end, the Axis powers often matched or exceeded their Allied counterparts in terms of individual weapon quality or technological breakthroughs, smaller arms, light machine guns, jet fighters, high-performance piston-driven fighters, such as the German FW-190 or the Japanese Nakajima Ki-84, ballistic and cruise missiles. Yet such Axis weapons were either produced in too few numbers or used by too few soldiers, ultimately to affect the course of the war, or simply were not mechanically reliable or economically feasible to employ. So this difference between the quality and quantity discussion between the Allied and Axis powers.
It was true of all of the Axis. The Italians made wonderful plane engines. They were great, and they had some really elaborate Beretta arms, but they had no concept of a Henry Ford assembly line. And the American, I guess it reflected the American values or the American ethos, but the idea was we're going to bury them with weapons that are good enough, but we're not going to waste time on trying to have precision weapons that might clog or might, and the Germans were craftsmen and we were producers. And that proved very important. The other thing that was important is you would think that an authoritarian society could, by diktat, say, we're going to go into war production, you're not going to have any civilian expenditures. But they had no legitimacy. So Hitler was still producing silk stockings for women in 1945, that you couldn't buy them in the United States. So things that you could not buy in the United States were being produced in Italy and Germany, and even in occupied Europe. He never was able to consolidate the French economy, occupied the Dutch economy, because he felt that that he was illegitimate. And in the occupied territories, if he clamped down too hard, there would be open revolts. In Germany, if he denied women nylon, or not nylons, the precursor of nylons, or if they couldn't have Dutch chocolate or Swiss chocolate, then they would, the legitimacy for decisions he had to make would not be there. But not in America. The attitude was, you voted for Roosevelt, you voted for the Congress, it's your word, you wanted to go to war, because if you didn't want to go to war, you would have thrown these people out in 1940 or 1942. And so we were able to get the consent of the people to take on drastic measures that only we could do. The Soviet Union was forced to do it after they lost half of their territory, but we did it willingly, and Britain did it willingly. You couldn't buy tobacco in Britain. You could not buy milk in Britain. You couldn't buy ice cream. They had ersatz everything. And that was because the people had given their consent to the government to win the war at any cost. And the Germans wanted to win the war at any cost, but they never explained to the German people or the Italian people, here's exactly where we are in the battlefield. We need this done. They lied to them. Only, finally they said, we need all the women and men's fur coats, we need to send to Stalingrad, because we didn't prepare as we did in 1941, we didn't prepare in 1942 for winter. But it was at the last moment in desperation. And
I wanted to come back to something else that you mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth drilling down on here in this chapter titled "The Workers," is the importance of regime type as it related to cooperation in the development and production of arms. You make this point here, and I quote, "World War II was fought by coalitions. The respective Axis and Allied alliances reflected quite different industrialized economies. Unfortunately for the Axis, the German, Italian, and Japanese war industries were rarely complementary in the sense of either sharing key scientific and industrial expertise or sending direct material aid to one another, especially in comparison to the far more effectively integrated Allied war machine."
Yeah, it was tragic. Germany could have really used aircraft carriers. They were building one and they couldn't build one. Japan, they would never have thought that the so-called inferior Japanese were light years ahead of them. And all the Japanese needed to do was to send one of their most, 1938 advanced carriers before the war started, say, here it is, build stuff like that. And by the same token, the Germans were way ahead of them in cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and in fighter aircraft. And they could have told the Japanese that. And they just didn't trust each other. And they were working at cross purposes. They were always fighting over the spoils before they had obtained the spoils. Mussolini said, I want some of France. I want Albania, I want Greece, I want this in North Africa. And Hitler would say, no, I've already promised that to the Romanians or something, or we can't take that from the Vichy's. But they never coordinated. And again, it gets back to that central principle that if you don't inform the public and you don't get their legitimate consent, then it doesn't matter when things go well, then you're considered a genius. But when things ultimately and inevitably go badly, then you need the people to stick with you. And that's what the Allies had. Stalin, believe it or not, was a much more, he was even more authoritarian than Hitler. But Stalin reached in 1941 the area where Hitler was in 45. And he never was he never was a liberal. He was a cutthroat mass murderer. But even he understood that if you had commissars telling generals what to do, you were going to end up with more 600,000 men lost in an envelopment. So by mid-1942, he had abolished the commissar system. And you would not believe it, but he actually said to Konev and Zhukov, basically the message was, as long as you don't think that you're ever going to rival me, or that I'm going to give you credit for what you do, you have complete control on the battlefield to operate. And he had some lunatic ideas, Stalin, and they kind of just ignored him. And so he had some generals that were pretty much had the same or even greater strategic latitude that American or British generals did.
I wanted to conclude our conversation here with a chapter you title The Dead. We established in our last conversation that World War II is the deadliest war in human history. And we touched on a few reasons why that was. Obviously, as we've just discussed, there was the technological component, the lethality of the arms that were used. But there's also this element of ideology. And so I wanted to read this section here, and just as we come to our conclusion here, get your thoughts on it. World War II was an ideological war waged in the new age of secular modernism. There have been centuries of conflicts fueled by religious ideas, revolutionary fervor, and ethnic chauvinism in the West, from the Crusades to the 30 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars, that transcended traditional disputes over personality, succession, territory, resources, and politics. But totalitarian ideologies of World War II, often claiming pedigrees from Darwin to Nietzsche to Marx and Engels, re-energized theories of racial superiority, state power, mass participation of civilians, technological determinism, and national destinies as never quite seen in the 2,500 years of Western history. Modernism had helped to reinvent morality in relativist terms.
Yeah. Well, it was unfortunate for World War II that the two, until 1941, the two powers that were most authoritarian and had the most pernicious secular ideologies were Nazism and communism. As long as they had a partnership, World War II, had we not entered, and maybe even if we had entered, would have been over with very few casualties. They would have won. Hitler would have won. I don't know what he would have done with us. We don't know what we would have done. But had he not attacked the Soviet Union, you pretty much would have had the entire Asia and Euro and North African landmass under the control of communism or Nazism, and they would have been in league along with Japanese militarism. But once they went at it, then that was an existential war because they had the same values: no prisoners, absolute annihilation, no concern about civilians. In fact, if you took the Versailles Treaty or the Geneva Convention, where in terms of what was permissible in war, or the Nuremberg trials later, the German army, not Hitler, the Nazi party, but it probably adhered, and it was awful, but it adhered more closely to the rules of war maybe than even the Soviet Union. If you look at it just dispassionately and say, what was World War II all about? How could you reduce it in conclusion? It was, in terms of the dead, it was basically a story, 65 to 70 million, and that number keeps going up as the Chinese try to release statistics and the Russians do, because that's where the dead were. So you could argue that somewhere around 75% of all people, civilian and military, were killed by Japanese, Russian, or Germans. And in the great majority of cases, you could even refine it a little bit more narrowly. World War II was a story of Germans and Japanese killing civilians. And by that I mean 27 million Russians died, probably 20 million of them were civilians. 6 million in the Holocaust apart from that number. That's 26 million. And the Japanese killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million Chinese, the vast majority starved out and killed. And so you can very easily get up to 40, 45 million civilians of the 65 total dead were exterminated by those two powers. And that had not happened in World War I. World War I, 60 to 70% of all the casualties were military. But the vast majority of casualties in World War II were civilians, and they were committed by the Germans and the Japanese. This is very important because as we speak, you and I have talked last time about revisionism, and there's this in the West, but particularly in China, and in Russia and in Japan, there's all of this revisionism about what World War II was about. In particular in Japan, there's the idea that they were bullied or they had to go to war or we cut off their oil. In Germany, there's this idea that they wanted to make some kind of an agreement, or what happened in Russia was an accident because they was just overwhelmed by prisoners. But none of that is true. If you refine it even further and you look at the number of dead German soldiers and civilians and dead Japanese soldiers and civilians, and you equate that with the number that those regimes killed, it turns out that World War II is a story of the most efficient killing machines in history in Germany and Japan, killing people and taking relatively few losses. And a lot of people would say, well, the German army lost 3.5 million and there was 1 million German civilians, maybe. Yes, but they killed 27 million people, soldiers and civilians in Russia alone, and probably 35 in the Holocaust and in occupied Europe. In Japan, yes, they may have lost somewhere between 2 and 3 million soldiers and civilians, 500,000 civilians from bombing. But they killed well over 20 million Pacific Islanders, Asians, Allied soldiers, and of course Chinese civilians versus their losses. They were very vicious people. And we should always remember that when we hear in Japan or we hear today in Germany, well, you firebombed us. How dare you? You dropped the atomic bomb. And the answer is we had to, because you unleashed these murderous regimes that were targeting civilians and butchering innocent men, women, and children. And you killed 60% of all the people in World War II at very little cost to yourself. I know the old people say, very little cost, Victor. But compared to what they inflicted, it was relatively incomparable at what the damage versus what they suffered.
Victor, I wanted to end there because it really does touch on, I think, one of the foundational themes of the Graduate Policy School at Pepperdine, which is, to borrow from Richard Weaver, ideas have consequences.
Yes.
And I know that in the class that you teach and many of the lessons that you offer, it's not simply about the quantitative aspect of militaries of certain sizes with certain kinds of weapons, but there really are these foundational ideas that really have to be considered and confronted.
I think it's very important for young students, when they evaluate the quality of leadership or policy in the present, when they look back at the past, they should start with the assumption that what people did was logical, being human nature. It can be flawed under greater inquiry and greater information. You're absolutely right to criticize them and say Roosevelt made a mistake or Churchill, but you should understand why they made those decisions given the time. And so if you say, not in my name should Roosevelt, Truman drop, not in my name should Roosevelt have made the bomb and Truman dropped it. Put yourself back in there and look at 50,000 casualties in Okinawa by July 1945, with 7 million Japanese under arms on the mainland, and probably 7,000 to 8,000 kamikaze cruise missiles facing us from a regime that had already killed 20 million people. Then it becomes a little bit more complex. But we never do that in our age. We want simple yes, no, good, bad evaluations, and no policymaker is ever going to confront that situation where it's an easy yes or no.
Yeah, and certainly the higher up you go in leadership, these decisions only get more difficult.
Yes, they do. They do. And I think one of the ways that people can understand that and be better leaders is look at history.
Yeah.
It's the best instructor, I think.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Victor, and we're, again, just so honored to have you,
Thank you.
As our Giles-O'Malley visiting professor. And that will conclude this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to our third and final Office Hours episode coming your way here in the next few weeks. That'll do it here from Brock House on the campus of Pepperdine School of Public Policy here in Malibu, California. Thanks so much for joining us.